Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of History to Fall Asleep To. I am your host, the Modern Monarchist, just wondering how close I can get to this microphone before it gets a little too loud. Well, I'm not going to talk this close because this is the typical podcast voice distance, and that's just cringe. But anyways, we're talking about the Spanish Civil War. It's probably been too long to even count because I did 2 episodes of this wonderful book so far, and it's been a while. Again, we are talking about the Spanish Civil War. We're going month by month, year by year, fact by fact. So without further ado, which I've done a lot of a-doing, let's get back into where we were. It is spring, April June. By an unbroken tradition extending all the way back to the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, the Archbishop of Toledo is the primate of Spain, for Toledo is Spain's ancient capital. Crowning a gigantic crag towering over the Tagus River in the midst of a broad, dry plain, Toledo is virtually impregnable to attack. It has never been stormed against a vigorous defense in the whole history of war in Spain. After the Moors had held Toledo for more than 350 years, the Christians regained it by negotiations in the time of El Cid. They glorified it with one of Spain's most magnificent cathedrals. Isabel and Ferdinando built here their splendid church of St. John of the Kings. The banner Don Juan of Austria carried into battle against the Turks at Lepanto hung in Toledo's Church of the Holy Cross. In one of its humble parish churches glowed the greatest work of Spain's supreme painter, El Greco, who dwelt in Toledo for most of his adult life. The painting is the burial of the Count of Orgaz. On May 6th, 1931, shortly after the flight of King Alfonso XIII and the formation of the Second Spanish Republic, Cardinal Pedro Segura, Archbishop of Toledo and Primate of Spain, issued a pastoral letter urging his flock to respect and obey the new government and to participate actively as Catholics in its political life. But he also made a point of praising the departed king, and it was known that he believed the establishment of a republic was not good for Spain. His alleged interference in politics because of these sentiments was made an excuse for the burning and looting of many Spanish churches a week after the release of his pastoral letter. On returning in June from consolations with Pope Pius XI in Rome, Cardinal Segura was arrested and expelled from the country on the intriguing charge of endangering the public spirit. 2 months later, the government declared, though utterly without authority to do so, that he was removed as Archbishop of Toledo and stripped of his episcopal rank. The reason given for this action was that he had instructed the Spanish bishops to sell church property and send the money out of Spain before the anti-Catholic government could confiscate it. At this point, Pope Pius XI was trying to cultivate better relations with anti-Catholic governments in Catholic countries, such as then existed in Mexico as well as in Spain. He was hoping that the anti-Catholic provisions of the Constitution of the Second Spanish Republic, then still in the drafting stage, might be removed or moderated in response to concessions by the Church. Therefore, in October, the Pope consented to Segura's removal and exile. After a long wait before renaming a replacement, in 1933 he appointed as the new Archbishop of Toledo Isidro Goma, a Catalan who had been rector of the seminary of the Archdiocese of Tarragona for more than 20 years, and then Bishop of Tarazona. He was reputed to be a political moderate, sympathetic to the Catalan nationalists. In 1935, the Pope named him Cardinal. But serious churchmen cannot be measured by political standards. Cardinal Goma could read the signs of the times in the spring of 1936 as well as any communist or Carlist. He knew they portended far more than a mere strife of parties, that for the first time in its Christian history, his country faced the strong possibility of the destruction of its traditional faith. He did not yet believe the time had come to declare openly all that he foresaw. But in a letter to Father Ledowski, general of the Jesuits, which order had already been expelled from Spain, as Cardinal Segura had been, he let the warning bells toll. Quote, "With reference now to the general state of things in Spain, prospects are frankly most evil, with no remedy to be seen, humanly speaking. The revolution is triumphant, without scruples in its advance to secure its grip, with the insensitivity of the government in the face of the unheard-of atrocities that the Church has suffered in recent weeks, the threat of applying the atheistic constitution in its totality, the confusion of the political elements of the right, some drawn apart from others by angry grudges, loss of the spiritual rigor of our Christian people, the effect of past disillusionments, economic burdens, the imminence of municipal elections which will bring revolutionary principles and practices into the heart of the people, fear and cowardice, which has debilitated organizations of religious, the restriction and the reduced circulation of the Catholic press, the imminent establishment of greatly expanded lay education. Such is the spectacle that this moment shows us. No remedy for this appears but an extraordinary providence of God." End quote. If there were any doubt of the truth of this warning by the Primate of Spain, it was laid to rest by comments made by Prime Minister Azana in the Cortes, April 3rd and 16th, in response to criticism of the government's conspicuous failure to protect the churches. Quote, "The Republican government and the President do not undertake to justify anything or explain anything away. We must examine this situation like men and understand things in their broad, human sense. I am scandalized that anyone should state how horrible that 3 churches have been burned. I also say, if not how horrible, what nonsense and what a pity. I am persuaded that flames are endemic to Spain. In the past, heretics were burned, and today saints, even if in the form of statues or images." Attacks on churches and objects of the holy devotion were evidently amusing to the chief of the Spanish government in the spring of 1936, a matter for joking rather than for action. But they were no joke to the Church's committed enemies, or to her committed defenders. On April 3rd, the Cortes, holding its first formal session since the election, chose Diego Martinez Barrio, a political ally of Azana, as its presiding officer, and proceeded immediately and surprisingly to impeach President Alcala Zamora, a move and the majority of the cabinet had decided upon the preceding day. The grounds, oddly enough, were his dismissal of the previous Cortes when the Constitution prohibited the president from dismissing the Cortes more than once in his 5-year term of office. The oddity was for a government to impeach its president for calling an election that brought them to power. But the Popular Front government did not trust Alcala Zamora. Knowing that he remained a Catholic and was opposed to revolution, they feared he might dissolve the Cortes for a 3rd time and call another election, or even support a military coup against them. The right regarded Alcala Zamora as a weakling, or worse, and made no effort to save him. His political fate was sealed. On April 7th, he was removed from office, to be replaced the next month, as was the government's intention from the beginning, by Azana, who had no Catholic sympathies, nor much use for the military, and would do nothing that might return power to the right. Azana does not seem to have been significantly involved in carrying out this surprising deposition, which Salvador de Mardiaga extravagantly condemned as the most glaring denial of logic the history of a free nation can show. Alcala Zamora left Spain for South America just before the Civil War broke out in July, and never came back. His removal had virtually no effect on the immediate political situation, but had one important and unexpected long-term consequence. One of the most Republican generals, Gonzalo Quiapo de Lelano, a rakishly handsome, arrogant, and contentious figure who had been thrown in jail by Primo de Rivera and had turned against the Catholic Church while enrolled in a seminary in his youth, had a daughter married to Alcala Zamora's only son. Quiapo de Lelano was outraged by the impeachment of his daughter's father-in-law. On April 13th, he visited General Mola, now in Pamplona, to tell him he wished to join in the rising against the government being planned, and soon persuaded General Miguel Cabanellas, another Republican stationed at Segovia, to do likewise. Quiapo de Lelano, a man of extraordinary dash and daring, unfortunately almost his only admirable qualities, played a vital, if not always savory, role in the history of the first months of the Spanish Civil War. Had it not been for the removal of Alcala Zamora, he probably would have fought on the other side. His initial service to the rising was indispensable, but later his cruelty and injustice traduced its Catholic and crusading character. April 14th, 2 days after Easter, was the fifth anniversary of the establishment of the Second Spanish Republic. The day before, Phalangists had shot and killed on a Madrid street a judge who had sentenced one of their members to 30 years in prison for murdering a distributor of socialist newspapers. During the public commemoration of the anniversary in Madrid, an unidentified man, probably a Phalangist, attempted to kill Azana with a bomb. Azana was not injured, but one of the assault guards, a police force generally loyal to the government, shot and killed a member of the civil guard, whose loyalties were mixed like the army's, whom he believed was preparing to shoot Azana. To think that the revolution could be stopped by shooting the helpless Azana was the height of folly, but logic did not flourish in Spain during these tumultuous days. The funeral of the civil guardsman 3 days later was the occasion for a gun battle between socialists and Phalangists during the funeral procession, and another between Phalangists and the assault guards at the cemetery. Lieutenant José Castillo of the assault guards played a leading part in the cemetery battle, earning him the bitter hatred of the Phalangists. At least 12 people were killed in the fighting. Gil Robles, speaking in the Cortes, delivered another solemn warning. Quote, "When we, the parties that act within legality, begin to lose control of our masses, we begin to appear failures in their eyes. The idea of violence to fight against persecution starts to germinate among our people. A time will come when, as a citizenly obligation of conscience, we shall have to turn to our masses and tell them, within legality you have no protection, because the law, which is the supreme guarantee of the rights of citizenship, does not enjoy the government's support. In our party we cannot defend you. With anguish, we must tell you to go to other organizations, to other political nuclei that offer you at least the attraction of revenge." End quote. At a public meeting on April 18th, the day after the bloody funeral of the civil guardsman, the Social Party of Madrid formally demanded that the forthcoming National Congress of the Socialist Party call openly for the dictatorship of the proletariat, seizure of all church property, and suppression of all religious orders. Once again, the centrality of the religious issue in the build-up to, as well as the waging of the Spanish Civil War, was unmistakably demonstrated. Just across the French frontier in the Pyrenees, Prince Javier of Bourbon-Parma, now the designated heir to the childless Alfonso Carlos, to whom the religious issue was central also, had taken up residence in the little town of Saint-Jean-de-Luz during Holy Week. Every few weeks he conferred with Falconde or the Carlist military leaders in Navarra. The Carlists continued to operate independently of the regular army generals, except for Varela, who was imprisoned in Cadiz during April, and Sanjurjo, exiled in Portugal. General Mola, though stationed in the capital of Carlist Navarra, was not yet working with them. During the latter part of April, he crossed the Rubicon with a confidential circular letter to selected officers whom he felt could be trusted. The most grave circumstance, through which the nation is passing, owing to an electoral pact, the immediate consequence of which has been to make the government prisoner of the revolutionary organizations, is fatefully leading Spain to a chaotic situation that can only be avoided by means of violent action. Therefore, the elements that love the country must of necessity organize themselves for rebellion, with the aim of conquering power and imposing therefrom order, peace, and justice. May Day was marked by strikes and parades in most of the principal cities of Spain. Thousands marched down Castellana Street in Madrid, making the clenched fist salute, singing the Marxist hymn Internationale, carrying portraits of Lenin, Stalin, Largo Caballero. Prieto, speaking in Cuenca in central Spain, called for socialist entry into Azana's government, and denounced excesses that leave behind as evidence of the people's exertions some charred images, some burnt altars, or some church doors blackened by flames. He warned of the growing danger of a military coup. Largo Caballero's followers accused him of supporting such a coup and began threatening his life. These were not idle threats. Before the month was over, Prieto was shot at and wounded by some of Largo Caballero's militant followers while speaking at a socialist rally in Ejicha, barely escaping in a car through a hail of bullets. During May, membership in the Spanish Communist Party reached 60,000, a total comparable to the listed membership of the Socialist Party. On May 4th, a number of churches in Madrid were attacked. 3 nuns and 2 lay women were killed by a mob, and several monks and nuns attacked and severely beaten. Early in May, Carlist Prince Javier was in Portugal conferring with General Sanjurjo. They agreed that if the Carlists and the Spanish army rose together against the government, Sanjurjo would head a provisional government for the restoration of the monarchy, not specifying the monarch to be restored, but if the Carlists had to rise alone, Sanjurjo would support Alfonso Carlos as king. Sanjurjo sent a letter to Mola by the prince, which assumed he would lead any army uprising which might take place, and another letter to Alfonso Carlos, declaring his respect and adherence to him. If not quite a full endorsement of Alfonso Carlos's claim to be king, this was very close to it. Sanjurjo seemed on the verge of becoming a Carlist, as Varela had done. On May 10th, a special electoral college convened for this one occasion, overwhelmingly voted Azana president of Spain. The electoral meeting was enlivened by fistfights in the corridors between supporters of Largo Caballero and Prieto. On the same day, the anarchist union CNT was holding its national congress at Zaragoza, capital of Aragon in northern Spain. It denounced the Azana government as too conservative and voted to accept Largo Caballero's offer of revolutionary syndical unity, so long as the socialists continued to refuse collaboration with the moderate left or the existing political system of the Republic, and to move directly toward the total destruction of the existing politico-economic order. The Congress political program included the closing of all churches, the seizure of all factories, and all tracts of more than 50 hectares of land by the people, who would then set up the Confederation of Autonomous Communes, which was the only form of government acceptable to the anarchists. They need not have worried about the Socialist Party entering the government, despite Prieto's call for it. On May 12th, the Socialist deputies in the Cortes voted 49-19 against doing so. This left newly elected President Azana no alternative but the formation of another minority government, staffed by left Republicans, but spurned by both socialists and communists. He gave this thankless task to Santiago Casares Quiroga, a thin, nervous, tubercular Galician with a burning hatred of the church but little capacity to lead. A few days before becoming prime minister, Casares Quiroga had told Calvo Sotelo that social revolution does not worry me. Most of his cabinet ministers were drawn from Azana's left Republican Party. Speaking to the Cortes for the first time as prime minister on May 19th, Casares Quiroga pledged total hostility to fascism and said he needed no support outside the Popular Front. Despite the excesses of the Falange, still forming a small minority of the Spanish right, fascism was hardly the principal danger to Spain at that moment. As Calvo Sotelo declared in a thundering speech before the Cortes May 29th, Parliament is haughtily, pompously presiding over the Spanish anarchy. The legislative power gives an impression of normality, while all the other powers, the whole of Spanish life, are the personification of chaos, disorder, and abnormality. You are living in anarchy, because to repress it, you would have to forfeit the political oxygen which these extreme forces give you. Have the courage to die slaying anarchy, and Spain will be saved. On May 30th, writing to San Yerjo, recognized the older general's leadership and right to head the provisional government to be set up after the projected military coup. Mola acknowledged this because he was a director of the plans for the army rising. Mola's plans included a fallback to Carlis Navarra and a fight to the finish there if the rising failed elsewhere. During June, he made the first specific assignments of officers to command the rising in various cities, though many of them were later changed. But the two most important assignments did not change: General Franco and Colonel Juan de Yagu to Morocco. Despite being separated from Spain by the Straits of Gibraltar, Morocco was vital to the uprising because, since the Rif War in which the native Muslims of Morocco had first defeated the Spanish and then been defeated by them, the greater part of the Spanish professional army was stationed there. Only soldiers of long service could be counted on to follow orders to strike against the constituted government without qualms and danger of mutiny. This was especially true of the numerous Moroccan Muslims the Spanish had taken into their army, who cared nothing at all for the politics of Spain. Yagu, a blunt and hard-hitting soldier who was one of the few high-ranking Spanish officers then to sympathize with the Falange, was already in Morocco and could plan the rising there in advance. Franco was isolated on the Canary Islands out in the Atlantic and would have to be brought to Morocco, where he had gained a high reputation for courage and good fortune in the war against the Muslim rebellions. Despite his relative youth, he was 44, he was one of the highest-ranking Spanish generals. He had been commandant of Spain's military academy, and thereby had come to know most of the officers. Though usually cold and aloof in public, and a poor public speaker, he could be charming in personal conversation, was not overbearing in manner, and was generally well-liked and trusted. Most officers in personal touch with him would obey him in a crisis. No one then thought of Franco as the leader of the generals' uprising. That was to be San Giorgio, as soon as he could be brought in from Portugal, and for the time being it was Mola. But Francisco Franco was destined to become the Cadillo of Spain for 38 years, one of the most controversial figures in modern history.